So we have kind of a modified version of, some general ed classes, some special ed classes, but I think the biggest thing that was missing was the connection to the peers because, by ninth grade, the typical kids are, just leaps and bounds away from where Meg was. And there just wasn't a cohort of kids that had a similar profile as she did. So, the poor kid was eating lunch by herself a lot of days and she's a social kid. So it wasn't the right placement. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So now she's at a different placement and absolutely thriving because the right placement can just make all the difference in the world.
Yes, I totally agree. And, I was going to ask you when you're talking about going to mediation, just to give some background, what kind of research did you do preparing for, advocating for Meg in those situations?
So as an engineer by trade, I love data. I love looking at numbers. I love graphing things. So that was one of the most important things, that was in our toolbox to use at the time is, we were looking at Megan's reading data and benchmarks. And this was data that the district gave us. At that point, I didn't, do a lot of outside testing. And I just used the district's data. Every quarter, they'd tell me what her benchmarks were for Ames Web and Dibbles and DRAs and things like that. And I put them in an Excel spreadsheet and I graphed them and I started seeing like, okay, there was some growth initially, but now for several quarters, it's been stagnant. And I brought those graphs to the mediation and the mediator looked at them and she said like, all right, I don't understand all of this testing and everything, but I know a flat line is no progress.
Yeah. And
it was
data.
Just so evident. Yeah, there was that data. And I think that's so important for parents to have data and either use the school's data. And if they don't give it to you, you need to ask for it. There should be data in all the progress reports that we get. A good IEP goal is going to say, the kid will do X task, 80% of the time. Well, every quarter they should be telling you where they are. And not just, Johnny's making progress. It should be, okay, this quarter, the goal is 80%. This quarter he's at 50. Next quarter he's at 60. Next quarter he's at 70. And if you don't get that data, you need to ask for it because data is what you need to use to make all decisions, but both from the school side as well as the parent side. The school should not be coming to you saying, oh, he doesn't need 4 times 30 of speech. He only needs 2 times 30 of speech. Well, where's the data that says that? Right. And likewise, the parents shouldn't be going to the school saying, oh, this placement isn't working just because I don't feel it is. No, you need the data to prove it. So both sides really need to use data,
and that's something that I know a lot of parents aren't aware of. And the way you explain it, how you use the data that was already there is really helpful and something that I'm going to take away from this going forward. I don't think a lot of parents, I think it's an intimidating term, use the data or whatever. Well, where do we get the data? How do we put this together? But what you just said was, really a beautiful simplification. I'm sure a lot of work went into it, but taking the IEPs and what they give you and making sure that if you get an IEP progress report and there isn't data or there isn't those kinds of updates asking for it, that's great information.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important too is use some of the bigger data too, your 3-year revals, or if you do outside testing from a neurosite, which I think is critical.
Crucial.
But using, okay, you get those reports and those reports are always so hard to read because it says in black and white all of the deficits that your child has. And I mean, I've been in tears reading them because, it makes your child look so awful.
Oh, I'm telling you, Stacey, I used to see those, and I think I went through a phase where I'd put them in the recycle bin, and then I'd go get them out. Like, I can't look at this right now.
They're so hard to read, but looking at that data, because a lot of times they do the same test, year after year or every 3 years, and looking at, okay, what's going on with that test? Okay, the child, 1 year, was 6 months behind, which, that's not too bad. But then when you do the same test 3 years later and the child has only made 6 months worth of progress in 3 years, that's a problem.
Yes.
You know?
Oh man, yeah. Big time. Yeah, and I think, parents, again, to play both sides, parents don't know, how to compile it, and the school doesn't know that the parents are completely overwhelmed by looking at these reports. But I think you've just got to power through it. If I had to say anything to parents that have one of the many things, have an IEP and are struggling looking at it, just, there's a higher purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
to get that data and to track it, especially if your child's having any issues.
Right. Yeah. And then the other thing to look at too is how they're meeting their goals with progress reports. Is honestly, I would get the quarterly progress report and I'd look through it going, all right, she's doing good. And I'd kind of put it in the file. But the last couple of years, I really started looking at, okay, is she making growth? Because at IEP meetings, yes, there's a little recap of, okay, the child did well in these areas. Let's make new goals. But you never really look through, and there's typically not a big discussion of, okay, did that child actually meet that goal that we had last year, or are we just tweaking it a little bit and making it a new goal for next year?
Yes, and it's so, it can be way too vague, the goals. And I think that's one thing I learned from the seminar that you brought to the district with Terry Rabos a few years back, as far as having, the tangible goals and benchmarks, and that's a whole other subject.
It's so important. And then following up on that and holding people accountable to, okay, the child is not making progress in this one area. Well, why? And if we just keep doing the same thing, it's not going to magically get better. Something needs to change if a child's not making progress. Yes.
And I think I've sat at tables where I could tell that, to challenge, what was there was a little uncomfortable, and it was going to force the school to do something that's a little bit off the beaten track. But they were willing to do it because the data supported the lack of progress or the goal not being met.
Yeah.
So, wow.
And that's the nice thing about using data too, is it's less confrontational. It's not you saying, I don't feel like you're doing enough with my child. It's saying, look what the data shows. Draw your own conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's something I wish I'd known more about. But I think going forward, and especially for new people with a new diagnosis or finding out their kid has some special needs, start with getting the data when you.
Yes. Yep.
So, I just give you props totally for being such a phenomenal advocate. I am very, inspired.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I think to continue on with our discussion, I want to know a little bit about, first I thought about this with Megan. How did she handle the changes with the school? And how did you support that as far as, yeah.
It's been interesting, going from one school to the next. I think it's just been so helpful to do some type of transition planning, for each year. I think, one of the most important things that I've done, and I really recommend to new families and even, families that have been doing it a while, is in the beginning of every school year, I would put together like a 1-page fact sheet about Meg. I would have her picture on it. I would have my contact information. And it was basically the premise of, I know as a brand new teacher this year, you don't have time to sit down before school starts and read a 30-page IEP and digest all that, because I don't, I can barely do that. So here's my kid in a nutshell. Here's what works for her. Here's what doesn't work for her. Here's the really important stuff that you need to know on day one. Yes, you'll get to the IEP at some point, but this is what I feel is the most important stuff. And I think that's been really helpful to, shorten that learning curve of a new teacher getting to know her in the very beginning of the year. And then the other thing that we've tried to do from our end is, like when she was going up to Mount View, when she was going up to the high school, we spent a lot of time just walking the halls and getting her familiar up there and getting her comfortable. We used to do that at Davis Hill even, every single year. Okay, let's go find your classroom. Now let's see if you can find the cafeteria and get back. Let's make sure you know where the bathroom is. The important things like that is just walking the halls is so beneficial. And usually when we've been there, we run into other teachers there. And then that's been really helpful just to make that connection, and they can welcome her in. But just physically being there and spending time there has really helped transitions all along the way that we've had.
I imagine, yes. And I agree. I did do that quite a bit with the kids at certain points. I think definitely more with Jack, but we spent a lot of time visiting. Yeah. The next step, just to ease the anxiety, and so he could play out the routine of the day and get himself mentally prepared. And so, I think that's an absolutely essential suggestion.
Yeah. And I think, for other kids that have different needs and different challenges and different strengths, you can do more verbal conversation. When my typical daughter was going up to the middle school, like any middle schooler, she was very nervous and didn't know what to expect. And with her, we could talk through a lot of those things. Whereas Megan, that wouldn't have been helpful. She needed to see it. She needed to walk it. The experiential component.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, let's talk about your time on the school committee. So tell me a little bit about that, what made you decide to do that, and getting on there, and then.
So it was very easy to get on. I had a good friend at the time who was on there and kind of talked me into it. It was a last minute decision in our town. Basically, you have to go and get nomination papers and get 50 signatures on there. So literally it was the last weekend before they were due. I got my papers and I ran around like a lunatic at Big Y and the library and other places where people congregate. And basically at that time, there was no one running for school committee for that particular seat. So I had no competition. I didn't have to campaign or go door to door or do any debates or anything like that, which made it very, very easy.
Right. Yeah.
And then honestly, so I got on school committee and then ran again 2 other times, and I was very fortunate. Every time I ran, there was no competition, which, yes, it was easy, and yes, I enjoyed it at the time. But in hindsight, I kind of wish there was. I wish there were more people that were interested and, in wanting to be involved and make the time commitment to be involved. So yes, I was glad I didn't have competition, but, I wish more people were involved.
Absolutely. I think it's intimidating, and I had no idea it was so easy. Not easy, but because just you had the wherewithal to figure it out, but just to take the blinders off that procedure and let people know that it isn't as hard as you think.
It's really not. Yeah. There were no signs. There was no campaign, no postcards.
Right. That's what I imagined.
Yeah, it was basically you get signatures, which, I mean, honestly, really didn't take much time.
50 is not a ton.
No, it's not a ton. And then, in subsequent years when I had re-election, I just bring them to PTA meetings or, orientation at school, different things like that. And it was no problem at all. And then getting on the committee, one of the challenges with our committee is it is so big because we are a 5-town district. Each district or each town needs representation based on their population. So we end up with 22 people on our school committee, which is one of the largest ones in the state.
Really?
And yes, yeah.
I did not know that. 22.
Yeah, when I've gone to different, state functions and things, people are just shocked how big our committee is. So, the meetings are interesting, but a lot of stuff goes on, behind the scenes at subcommittee meetings and just in conversation. So it was a huge, huge learning curve coming on.
I can only imagine.
I didn't know anything about municipal finance and how the school district operate. I really didn't know a lot about that. So it was a huge